Welcome back. All right, so I've talked about this before, and I wanted to talk about it again today in a video on and of itself. I talked about the topic of, players who throughout their careers, there's the can you win with him kind of stigma attached to them, which will then change after they've won a Stanley Cup, just like that. We're already seeing players on the Florida Panthers as we get set for a Stanley Cup final between Florida and either Dallas or Vegas. We're already seeing, well, this is a redemption for these players, and if these players get in on the other side, then it's a redemption. And it just gets kind of silly for me because having watched hockey for as long as I have, I've seen so many redemption stories when it comes to the Stanley Cup playoffs. I don't really buy into the narratives that are out there that this player's too soft or that player's just not built for the playoffs or, well, clearly they'll never get a cup ring because. So when we look at the players on the board, these are six guys who there was a perception one way or the other. Either they weren't good enough to win the Stanley Cup or their team wasn't built to win a Stanley Cup. And it depended on how you viewed it. So we'll start things off with Steve Yzerman. Yzerman starts out with the Detroit team in 83-84 that is trying to get its reputation back in line. The late 70s were really rough. And the early 80s for Detroit, you saw them gradually getting more and more respectable, and the drafting of Steve Yzerman was brilliant, but they don't win a cup until 1997. So that's quite a while after his debut in 83-84. And there were some first-round losses along the way. 1984, 1985, 1989, 1991, 1993, and 1994. And those last three, yeah, Detroit had a pretty good regular season going, and then they couldn't get out of the first round. So there were definitely some conversations then. The Detroit Dead things existed until 1997 when they won the Stanley Cup. 1995, of course, they went to the Stanley Cup final. They did not get over the hump there, and there was definitely discussion at that point, too, of I guess Detroit's not really built to win when these games get really important, and that was definitely how that storyline was. So for Yzerman, the Stanley Cup is awarded to him at age 32. That's when he won his first Stanley Cup, 32 years of age. So now we can look back and say, well, there wasn't really that same criticism with Yzerman. There was definitely criticism of the Detroit Red Wings. I heard arguments they were too European. Then later on, they were too old. They just weren't built for playoff hockey. And yeah, there was plenty of that criticism out there. And so it took quite some time for Yzerman to silence some of those critics. Then we get to Joe Sakic. Joe Sakic, the argument with Sakic was he comes in 88-89 playing for a Quebec Nordiques team. So that's why I'm using the Avalanche magnet that's the throwback, because it's kind of a Quebec-Colorado situation, right? But with Sakic, he comes in 88-89 and the team that he's playing for in Quebec is bad. And they became historically bad. So the argument with Sakic was, will the Quebec Nordiques win a championship with Sakic as they get better? Is Sakic going to be built for that, or is he going to be too used to losing? Does he have that? And we've seen that too. The idea that, well, they're too comfortable with losing. They just don't have that fire, right? So Sakic would win the cup in 1996. Now he had first round losses in Quebec in 93 and 95, but of course it's the Colorado Avalanche that win in 96. And you could even make the argument that without Patrick Roy, maybe they don't win that Stanley Cup in 96. If they had stayed in Quebec, they definitely don't get Patrick Roy. Do they win the Stanley Cup that year? There you go. Sakic was 26. Easily the youngest on the board here at winning the Stanley Cup at 26. But I do remember those questions of whether or not Quebec, to get over the hump, might want to look at maybe moving Sakic. So crazy as that may sound now, I remember. And I'm not saying that was a really prominent opinion, but I heard it and I thought it was a head scratcher. And then Brett Hull. So I'm wearing my Hull jersey. Of course, it's a St. Louis jersey, not a Dallas one. But his first year in Dallas, his first year out of St. Louis, a Stanley Cup. He makes his debut in St. Louis in 86-87. His first Stanley Cup, of course, is in 99. He would move on to the Wings where he'd win another one, too. But the argument was, before he arrived in Detroit, can you win a Stanley Cup with Brett Hull? And in St. Louis, the answer was no. First round losses in 1992, 1994, 1995, and 1997. And St. Louis was a very good regular season team who faltered once the playoffs rolled around. And they would continue to have that kind of a reputation until 2019, they win the Stanley Cup and finally break that huge long drought for St. Louis. But Brett Hull had plenty of critics in St. Louis, and he was already in his 30s, and so his first Stanley Cup is at age 34 with the Dallas Stars. And yeah, it took him quite some time. Of course, there's controversy in that Stanley Cup win for Dallas, but Brett Hull was arguably one of the most important players to Dallas. And then after he won his second Stanley Cup, I remember an article that said we used to say you couldn't win with with Brett Hull, not Bobby, Brett Hull. Now we're saying you can't win without Brett Hull. So I thought that was interesting how that narrative changed. While I didn't think Brett Hull's game changed, you will see players as they get older, they're less worried about the individual stats and going for those goals all the time, and they become far more worried about the team aspect, and they get to be little bit better of a 200-foot player, usually. But yeah, Brett Hull, still a good goal scorer in Dallas, and had a really solid few years there. Then we get to Alex Ovechkin, the most recent example on the board. So 05-06, Ovechkin makes his debut with the Capitals team that's been bad. That's how they ended up getting that number one draft pick for Ovechkin, just being really pretty bad. They don't win the Stanley Cup, though, until 2018. First round upsets in 2008, 2010, and 2013. And I remember all the Ovechkin jokes. I made some of them myself. And then I started feeling bad for the Caps and realizing it wasn't really Ovechkin that wasn't coming up big in these games. That as Ovechkin got older, it was clear he really wanted that Stanley Cup ring. But the teammates around him maybe weren't quite as good. They had some downbeats, and I didn't think it reflected as much on Ovechkin. That first Stanley Cup win is at age 32. And to this date, it's his only Stanley Cup win. And it may very well end up being the only one in his career, but it's still one more than guys like Marcel Dionne had. So it is crazy to think of how much pressure goes on some of these players. And yet, for Ovechkin, he did get that cup win, so that's one less thing he has to worry about. Teemu Selanne comes into the league in 92-93. Bounced around the league a bit, goes from Winnipeg to Anaheim, ends up in San Jose, goes back to Anaheim. And in Anaheim, he would finally get that Stanley Cup in 2007. But it took some time. First round losses for him in 1993, 1999, and 2001. Not all in the same location. 93 would have been with the original Jets. But it does take a long time for Selanne to get that cup ring. And I remember there being plenty of criticism. Again, well, he's just a goal scorer, not really a playoff guy. And he was 36 when he won that first Stanley Cup. So, again, if you're talking about a player in their 20s and you're like, well, clearly he's never going to win a Stanley Cup. 32, 34, 32, 36. And then we get to Ray Bourque, who I felt like had to close out the board. Comes into the league in 79-80, and sadly, it's a Colorado logo next to his name. Sadly. And I say that because as a Boston fan, I honestly thought it was embarrassing that he went to Colorado to win that Stanley Cup, that he never got that Stanley Cup in Boston. And it was 2001 when he finally gets that Stanley Cup. So in Boston, the argument was never about whether or not Bourque was good enough that I can remember. But there were definitely first-round losses for the Bruins. 1981, 1984, 1985, 1986, 1987, 1993, 1995, 1996, and 1998. So finally, Boston says, Bourque's got looking to win a Stanley Cup ring, and so he goes to Colorado, and he would win that Stanley Cup at age 40. So for Bourque, he very nearly went his whole career without a Stanley Cup, which would not have kept him from being in the Hall of Fame, but there would have then been that question of, yeah, but was he really built for the Stanley Cup playoffs? Like, they get to the final in 88 and 90, but they got outclassed by Edmonton both times. So, how much of that is on Bourque? And the answer was it wasn't on Bourque. I say that as somebody who watched Boston a lot. But the criticisms that we see are very, very similar. And here's the thing. I can't find any proof this is what it is. So the one that gets me is too soft. There are a lot of players on Florida, Vegas, and Dallas, the three teams still alive, who are skill players, who don't, thump and bang in the corners, who aren't, built like a brick house, and they play just fine. So the idea that, well, if a player doesn't play that big physical game, they're not going to last in the playoffs. There are some cases where that's true, and I think it's true if you have a guy who's a big physical player in the regular season and then he's a ghost in the postseason. He doesn't really throw those hits. Then yes, I think you can make that argument. But those skill players, you need them. So the idea that everybody has to play like, that hard-nosed early 90s style of hockey, it's just that's not the case. And then you get the can't play in big games. There is some statistical evidence you can find for that. You look at goals and assists produced in elimination games, plus minus in elimination games, or just how many times that team has been in an elimination game and hasn't got over the hump. And when you're the main guy, you're going to get criticism for that. But they can't play in big games. All it takes is one game to turn that around. Oh, that's all it takes. That's it. Guy has one really big game in an elimination game or a game 7, and then he is known as being a clutch guy. It really doesn't take very much to turn that around. And being European. And I threw that on the board because I had to. It does feel like with European players that gets thrown out there as a reason of, well, they couldn't win with him because he's European, which means he's too soft, he can't play in big games. European player. And that gets thrown around a lot. And I don't think it's entirely accurate. Like, you could make that argument, say, maybe back in the 80s. I don't know how accurate it would have been back then either. But hockey has become just this hybrid of the European style and the North American style. There isn't this big clash. Like, what we used to love with hockey in the 80s was you'd have USSR come over, Soviet Union, come over, and you'd have Red Army come over to play against, North American players. And you would have Red Army come in, and they would have such a fantastic passing game. It was a clinic to watch. The passing of those teams in the 80s was just next level. And then you'd watch the North American players, and there was a lot of hitting. They were physically larger. And so it really came down to which game's going to win, that really big skill passing game, or will the North Americans figure out how to get in the middle of those passing lanes and just blast everybody wearing a Red Army jersey through the boards and win the game that way. We no longer have that style of hockey. There are plenty of North American players who play Euro-style hockey, and there are plenty of Europeans that come over that are pretty big and they can thump you through the boards, which started in the 80s anyways. I always thought the argument that, well, he's too soft, he's a European player. I never understood that because I always felt like, yes, there's less enforcers who are European, but still, there are still some guys who are European and can absolutely handle themselves if they need to. And then there's the no heart argument, which how do you quantify that? Because what we see on the ice and what's going on in a player's mind may not match at all. He may have exactly the right mindset and he may be out there just absolutely determined to win, and the puck just doesn't bounce his way. There's definitely some good fortune that smiles upon teams that have those wins, especially when you're looking at a run where a lot of overtime wins are in there. There's going to be some good fortune smiling on them, some good puck bounces, some deflections that hit the post instead of going in. And at the other end, the puck goes in instead of hitting the post. So I don't buy the no heart thing at all. And then you get into blaming the franchise. Would win somewhere else is a big one. I don't see that as much right now as I have in the past. Which is the argument of, like, for instance, say Elias Lindholm in Calgary. Well, if Elias Lindholm was in Colorado, would he have a better chance at a Stanley Cup? Well, yeah. But that's where that argument comes in, right? And you could use that with any of the big guys in Toronto. You use that with Marner, with Matthews, and say, all right, so could these guys win if they were in another city? And the answer is yes, they could also win in Toronto. And while people want to laugh and giggle at that, there's definitely some players on this board that we now view as all-timers and Hall of Famers and winners who at one point in time in their career weren't seen as winners at all. So and can't do it all by himself. So there's one of two arguments. Either he doesn't elevate his teammates or he can't do it all by himself. Can't elevate his teammates would still be in that, like, can't play in big games. But it is interesting how you'll see, for instance, Crosby can have two wingers who may very well not be, let's say, top tier wingers, and he might elevate their game. And then other seasons it may not happen. And the criticism that gets thrown at him at times when it doesn't happen is interesting to me. Although Crosby doesn't get on the board because he won a Stanley Cup relatively early in his experience. If he hadn't won that cup in 2009, I guarantee somebody somewhere before that win in 2016 would have said, see, Crosby's just not built for playoff hockey. This is why Pittsburgh's not going to win. He's good in the regular season, but he's not really built for playoff hockey. Look at his concussions. He's not really built for it. So there's definitely something to say for winning it early in your career so you don't have to worry about it. And then you can blame the league. So if you don't want to blame the player and you don't want to blame the team, you can blame the league, which is that the league didn't want him to win, which is this nebulous thing, which I'm sure there are some fans who really feel that way. Feel like, you know what, my team would have won, but the league doesn't want it. Okie dokie. And then that leads into you can blame the officials and say the officials are against him or his team. He can't win because clearly officiating has it out for that team and doesn't want them to win. So it does, I mean, that's almost impossible to prove, but it's impossible to disprove as well, right? So that's where that argument kind of becomes, you might as well talk to the wall at that point, because if somebody really believes that, you're not going to convince them that it's not true. But it is interesting to see how many players right now are waiting on that first Stanley Cup and their hearts being questioned and they're in their 20s. Ray Bourque was 40. Solani was 36. Hull, 34. Yzerman, Ovechkin, both 32. And Sakic, 26. Relatively young by comparison. But it is an interesting question of, so at what point do you just say, well, this guy's never going to win a Stanley Cup? Because I think that's a dangerous conversation to have. Because we've seen too many occasions where a player just proves people wrong. And sometimes being spurned by one organization and going to another can make that difference. I wouldn't say Hull was spurned by St. Louis, but Hull going to Dallas, he went there with something to prove. This was a Dallas team that was a contender, and he felt like he could put them over the top, and he did. He absolutely did. He's not the reason Dallas won the Stanley Cup, but he definitely helped them win the Stanley Cup. And so, yeah, full credit to him for that. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. So one question I have is this. Which players currently playing in the NHL who will have Hall of Fame careers do you think will win a Stanley Cup, but we're probably going to have to wait a while to see it? So which star player do you think is going to be the next one to win that first cup at, say, 36 or 34? And right now everybody's dunking on them and they can't play and they stink, but they're going to prove everybody wrong later. And then, of course, once they've proven everybody wrong, then you move on to the next guy, right? But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.